Hey guys, tonight we begin with the absurdly stressful life of an Egyptian pharaoh. From marrying your sister, to being responsible for the sunrise, to constantly checking your wine for poison. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just been born into the most powerful job on earth, and you're already failing at it. While other newborns are allowed to cry, burp, and make a mess of things, you're being swaddled in ceremonial linen, inspected by priests, and declared the physical embodiment of Horus, god of kingship. You're not just a baby. You're a political event. Your birth is accompanied by omens. Stars are observed. Sacred cows may or may not moo in your honor. Somewhere, a man with a shaved head and too much eyeliner is already carving your name into a stone tablet you'll never read. From your first breath, everyone around you is panicking, not because you're fragile, but because you're the next living god, which means if you so much as cough, the court astrologer might declare a national crisis. Childhood. Not happening. You don't get toys. You get ceremonial scepters you're not allowed to chew on. You don't get lullabies. You get hymns written in your honor and chanted by elderly priests who smell like frankincense and regret. Your crib is likely a gold-plated structure that's colder than the Nile in February. You are surrounded by a team of caretakers whose job is to prevent you from dying, disappointing the gods, or doing anything undignified like crawling. You are bottle-fed political expectations. Your first words are probably scripted. And if you try to play with your cousin, someone whispers, "He's fourth in line. Best keep an eye on him." Even before you can walk, you're being groomed to rule. Royal advisors are already plotting your education, your image, and probably your eventual spouse, who, spoiler alert, will share your last name and your jawline. And let's not forget, you're being raised to believe you are divine. That's not a metaphor. You are expected to internalize from a young age that the sun rises for you, which is adorable until you realize the entire kingdom will blame you if it doesn't. If you thought being born a living god came with perks like skipping school or spending your mornings feeding ducks by the Nile, think again. As a young pharaoh in training, your schedule makes modern CEOs look underemployed. Your day starts early, like stars still out, priests already chanting early. You're woken not by a gentle nanny, but by a steward holding a golden tablet detailing today's responsibilities. And no, take a nap isn't on it. First lesson, reading and writing hieroglyphs. These are not normal letters. They're tiny pictures of birds, eyes, and upside-down bread loaves that somehow form entire government policies. One wrong doodle, and you've accidentally sentenced someone to eternal torment. Then there's religious instruction. You're quizzed on the sacred names of gods, the proper way to bless a cucumber, and how many times to blink during an offering. If you mess up, a priest frowns at you like you just sneezed on Ra himself. You also study math, not to do taxes, but to build monuments. You're taught geometry not for fun, but because one day someone will ask you how to stack 2.3 million limestone blocks into a perfect triangle without accidentally inventing a leaning pyramid. Oh, and don't forget public speaking. You'll have to give speeches to crowds that think you control the weather. There's no winging it when your words might be interpreted as divine instruction. Say the wrong thing, and suddenly grain prices crash. Military strategy is next. You're 10. You've never even thrown a rock in anger. But now, you're expected to know battlefield formations, river crossing techniques, and how to casually mention smite the Nubians in conversation. Philosophy, you don't get that. Instead, you're taught how to maintain mayat, the sacred cosmic balance, which sounds poetic until you realize it means making sure crops grow, criminals don't rebel, and nobody insults the gods during flood season. All of this happens under the watchful eyes of tutors who are equal parts teachers, informants, and walking anxiety attacks. By the end of the day, your head is full of symbols, schedules, sacred laws, and just enough political paranoia to keep you up at night. In most childhoods, your friends are the kids who share snacks, toys, and a mutual desire to avoid homework. But when you're the future pharaoh, your friends are more like potential enemies wrapped in linen tunics. Every child you interact with is a political variable. That cheerful boy who races you through the palace gardens, he's the high priest's son, the one who always wins at board games, nephew of a general, and the girl you actually like talking to, already betrothed to your cousin for dynastic stability. You're not surrounded by friends. You're surrounded by people with titles, bloodlines, and very nervous-looking parents. Everyone plays nice, but only because you're considered sacred and their careers depend on your favor. That's not friendship. That's networking. Even your tutors report back on your behavior. Did you show signs of independence? Excellent. And also threatening. Did you question the rituals? Not excellent and possibly heretical. Did you ask if your cousin could stop staring at you during lunch? Alarming, and definitely going in the scroll. Privacy doesn't exist. You can't sneak away for fun because fun is suspicious. If you disappear for 10 minutes, someone alerts the palace guard. You're divine after all, and the divine must not wander off unattended like a common farmer's goat. And heaven help you if you show favoritism. Invite one child to play sonnet, and 3 others write angry letters in pictograms. Say something kind to a noble's daughter, and suddenly there's a rumor you've chosen your queen at age 9. So what do? You become guarded, polite, politically neutral. You master the art of laughing without meaning it and complimenting tunics you secretly hate. You learn to make every friendship seem equal, because if someone feels slighted, their family might conspire against you during breakfast. This is the royal version of no new friends. Not because you don't want them, but because any one of them might grow up to be your assassin, your rival, or worse, your brother-in-law. By now, you're not just a prince. You are officially divine, not royalty divine. Actual God on earth divine. The priests confirm it, the scrolls say it, and the people bow like you personally invented sunlight, which sounds impressive until you realize nobody asked if you were ready for that kind of pressure. Every time you sneeze, someone declares it a message from the heavens. Every step you take is ritualized, and every mistake you make must be carefully explained in a way that doesn't imply the gods are clumsy or forgetful. But here's the kicker. While everyone calls you Horus on Earth, you still stub your toe, still get pimples, and still get stomach aches from too many figs. Divine, maybe, but not immune to bad digestion. The contradiction is staggering. You're taught you're all-powerful, yet you can't leave the palace without 5 guards, 3 priests, and a chariot procession. You supposedly control the floods of the Nile, but if you trip over a cat, someone starts whispering about bad omens. You're also expected to maintain Mayat, the divine balance of the cosmos. It sounds poetic until you realize it means you're personally blamed if there's a drought, a riot, or a mildly disappointing harvest. And of course, there are rituals, constant, exhausting rituals. You must speak in special divine phrases. You eat sanctified food. You participate in ceremonies where you have to pretend to defeat evil using props and heavy golden objects while sweating in a linen tunic. Privately, you might feel doubt, maybe even boredom. But you can't say that because saying, "I'm not sure I'm a god," is the fastest way to cause a theological meltdown or get replaced by a cousin who is sure. So you smile, you bless statues, you wave from balconies, and you quietly wonder how many gods before you also secretly hated this job. Because here's the truth. Being a god wasn't liberating. It was a full-time performance with eternal consequences. You were expected to be perfect, mystical, and celestial. Even on days when all you really wanted was to eat a pomegranate in peace. And no one warns you that the higher they place you, the lonelier it gets at the top of Mount Divine Expectation. So puberty has arrived, your voice cracks, your body's changing, and just when things couldn't get more awkward, your advisors slide in with a scroll and a smile announcing, "It's time to choose a wife, preferably your sister." Yes, your sister. In the noble tradition of keeping the bloodline pure, a term that here means genetically risky, you're now expected to marry a close relative. Your aunt, your half-sister, your cousin, all perfectly acceptable options according to dynastic politics and zero genetic counselors. Romance, irrelevant. Personal preference, not part of the ceremony. This is about optics. You're divine. She's divine. And nothing screams divine legitimacy like holding hands at your wedding with someone who also shared your wet nurse. Meanwhile, the palace is buzzing. Court officials are debating which relative is the least related, like it's a riddle from the gods. The priests are thrilled. The bloodline stays heavenly. The servants are placing bets. You're just trying to pretend this is normal. But it gets better because it's not just about marriage. It's about heirs. Fast. You're barely past your first chin hair. And already there's pressure to produce a mini pharaoh to keep the line going. No pressure, kid. Just all of Egypt counting on your awkward teenage hormones. And while all this is happening, you're expected to remain calm, composed, and ceremonial. Because you're not just a husband, you're a symbol of order, fertility, and divine cosmic power. Especially during rituals where you're paraded with your new bride, who, to remind you again, may also be your niece. In private, you might feel disgust, confusion, or just the overwhelming need to flee into the desert and scream into a sand dune. But expressing that would make you look unstable. So instead, you nod, you smile, you attend the banquet, you marry your sister, and you convince yourself that it's for the good of the realm, because what's a little inbreeding when the fate of Egypt depends on you producing a suitably godlike heir who may or may not have 3 elbows. This is royal puberty, sponsored by genetics, politics, and denial. And the only thing more twisted than the family tree is pretending it's all completely divine. You've finally been crowned pharaoh. Time to enjoy the glory, right? Not quite. First, they glue a fake beard to your chin with beeswax and strap a cobra to your forehead. Congratulations. You now look like a very anxious statue with back pain. Let's talk about the crown. It's not a nice, lightweight royal accessory. It's a solid, often dual-layered headpiece made of leather, linen, and sometimes actual metal. You're wearing symbolism, heavy, sweaty symbolism, and you have to stand for hours while wearing it in the sun, while priests chant things in your ear about the universe depending on your posture. The double crown is the real star here. It combines the red crown of Lower Egypt with the white crown of Upper Egypt, signifying that you rule everything, which is beautiful in theory and terrible for your neck. It feels like balancing two helmets and a houseplant on your skull. Then come the ceremonial outfits. Long white kilts, leopard skin sashes, golden breastplates, all made to impress the gods and overwhelm your joints. Linen clings in all the wrong places. Gold doesn't breathe, and you're not allowed to fidget even if a bug crawls up your shin. And sandals, forget comfort. They're decorative. They're basically papyrus flip-flops that offer no arch support and remind you constantly that style in ancient Egypt came before circulation. But none of this is optional. You must look divine. Not comfortable on a chariot. Divine. Sculpted into eternal godhood. Divine. Even if you're sweating buckets, chafing in gold, and desperately trying not to faint into the Nile. Every outfit you wear, every color you choose, every feather sticking awkwardly from your headdress has cosmic implications. The wrong symbol could offend a god. The wrong color could signal political instability. The wrong hemline could accidentally summon a famine. No pressure. You are now part of a centuries-old fashion statement made for the gods, not for flexibility or airflow. And the only thing more exhausting than ruling Egypt is doing it while wearing 30 pounds of spiritual pageantry and pretending none of it itches. Your throne may be made of gold, but it's not ergonomic. And the only thing heavier than the crown on your head is the expectation that you wear it like you enjoy it. Being Pharaoh came with unlimited power and unlimited blame. You were worshipped as a living god, sure, but the moment something went wrong, the entire kingdom looked straight at you like you'd personally unplugged the Nile. Too much rain. Clearly Pharaoh is unbalanced. Not enough rain. The gods must be punishing Pharaoh. Crops failing. That's your fault too. And if someone stubbed their toe on a temple step, well, that's probably because you angered Bastet by sneezing the wrong way during last week's ritual. You were the head of state, head of religion, and head of cosmic maintenance. If the sun didn't rise properly, people didn't assume bad weather. They assumed you forgot to pray hard enough. You had one job: keep the universe running smoothly. You also had no idea how to actually do that. And because of your divine status, you couldn't admit ignorance. I don't know why "there's a plague of frogs" wasn't a valid response. You had to either pretend you had a plan or make up a ritual on the spot and act like you meant to do it all along. Even your dreams were public property. If you had a bad dream, your court astrologers would gather, scribble furiously, and probably declare that a new temple needed to be built immediately to protect Egypt from your subconscious. Got a headache? That's a national omen. Woke up late. An official scribe notes it down as a possible sign of apocalyptic imbalance. One sneeze too many, and a goat gets sacrificed just to be safe. And if things really went downhill, famine, uprising, plague, sandstorm, crocodile incident, the people didn't say, "Wow, nature is wild." They said, "Pharaoh must be weak." Or worse, maybe the gods want a new pharaoh. So, you walk around draped in gold, surrounded by incense and flanked by bodyguards, all while quietly wondering if your citizens are building a new statue or digging a new tomb. The role of Pharaoh wasn't just ruling the land, it was absorbing the blame for every mosquito bite, muddy riverbank, or undercooked sacrificial goose. Because when you're divine, there's no such thing as a simple mistake. It was never just your job to lead, it was your job to be perfect and take the fall when the universe hiccuped. Being Pharaoh meant early mornings. Your wake-up call wasn't gentle. It involved ritual chants, burning incense, and a group of heavily perfumed priests quietly judging your posture. A normal person might start their day with coffee. You You start by being ritually purified with water from a sacred pool that's probably colder than the afterlife. Then it's straight into wardrobe. Not for fun, but because your linen had to be blessed, pre-folded, and likely ironed with moonlight or something equally dramatic. You're barely awake, but you're already wearing 30 layers and a chest plate shaped like a falcon. Next, the ritual cycle begins. You enter the temple. A priest unrolls a scroll the length of a crocodile. You're expected to perform sacred gestures in perfect sequence. Hand here, nod there, smirk at the statue. Chant the name of a god you haven't studied since childhood. Forget making a mistake. One wrong syllable. And suddenly, you're being blamed for the Nile drying up, the cattle dying, or the moon not looking divine enough. Everything had to be done perfectly to maintain Mahat, the sacred balance of the universe, which for some reason was apparently hanging on your ability to wave incense correctly. The rituals weren't short either. Some ceremonies took hours, and you couldn't yawn, you couldn't slouch, you definitely couldn't say, "Hey, do we really need to rub sacred oil on all 43 statues today?" This wasn't just religious duty. It was national theater. Priests performed, scribes recorded, onlookers nodded in grim spiritual approval. Meanwhile, you stood in stiff silence, pretending you didn't have a cramp in your god leg. And all this happened before you did anything resembling ruling the kingdom. So yes, you were the most powerful person in Egypt, but your mornings were dictated by astrology, bird omens, and a ceremonial checklist that made modern tax forms look fun. By the time the sun actually rose, you were already exhausted and still had 12 more rituals, 3 public appearances, and 1 carefully scripted divine smile to go. As Pharaoh, you were the most powerful figure in the kingdom, and that meant every single person around you was either pretending to love you or calculating how to replace you. Your guards loyal, yes, until someone offered them enough gold, goats, or spiritual favors. Your advisors always smiling, always nodding, always accidentally reminding you that your cousin is very popular with the military. Even your cupbearer was suspiciously enthusiastic about bringing you drinks, like he wanted you to notice how not poisoned they were. And let's not forget your extended royal family, a tangled mess of half-brothers, uncles, and people named Ramesses who definitely wanted your sandals. These weren't relatives. These were succession applicants. Every hallway conversation could be an ambush. Every banquet a potential Last Supper. You couldn't relax in your own palace without wondering if the decorative cobra on your chair was decorative enough. The paranoia was justified. Assassinations were practically an Egyptian sport. If you died suddenly, it was often described as a divine mystery, which really meant someone got creative with date wine and scorpion venom. So, you developed habits. You had food tasters. You rotated servants. You changed your daily routine at random, not because it helped, but because at least it made betrayal slightly inconvenient. And sleep, good luck. You rested in a guarded room with triple locked doors, a ceremonial dagger under your pillow, and a guard you only half trusted standing at the entrance practicing his best "I didn't do it" face. But the most exhausting part wasn't avoiding death. It was pretending you didn't know it was coming. You had to stay calm, divine, and unbothered because showing fear meant weakness, and weakness meant opportunity. Every glance, every handshake, every well-timed compliment could be part of someone's rise to your throne. And if you made the mistake of trusting the wrong person, well, you wouldn't have to worry about politics anymore. Being Pharaoh wasn't about ruling. It was about surviving in a palace full of people who bowed during the day. and sharpened knives at night. As Pharaoh, you were expected to be many things: divine, wise, unshakably composed, and incredibly photogenic in 40-degree heat, while wearing a gold chest plate and a smile that didn't suggest imminent collapse. Egyptian public life was built around ceremony. Long, elaborate processions through streets packed with people who loved you, feared you, or just came for the free bread. You stood in chariots waving like a deity on parade, while secretly wondering if passing out was considered a bad omen. The outfits didn't help. You were decked out in elaborate robes, glinting jewelry, symbolic scepters, and a ceremonial headdress that trapped heat like a portable oven. Your linen stuck to places linen should never touch, and your sandals squished like they were stuffed with soggy papyrus. You'd stand through hours of rituals, blessing sacred cows, cutting ceremonial ribbons with a gold knife, naturally, and accepting offerings you didn't want from nobles you didn't trust. You smiled, nodded, and occasionally muttered, "May the gods bless you," while quietly dying inside. The sun, it didn't care you were a god. It beat down like a divine judgment. Your makeup ran. Your incense choked you. And yet every eye in the crowd was watching, expecting to see perfection, not heat stroke in a leopard skin sash. And if you did falter, if you looked tired or annoyed, or gods forbid, slightly human, the rumors would start. Pharaoh is displeased. Pharaoh is weak. The heavens are shaking. You miss one ceremonial goose blessing, and suddenly people are whispering about drought. Even the festivals, which sound like fun, were just more work. You had to attend banquets where you couldn't eat, dances where you couldn't move, and religious plays where you played yourself and still didn't get a speaking part. It wasn't celebration. It was theater, and you were the main actor every single time. At the end of the day, you limped back to the palace, drenched in sweat and divinity, wondering how many more statues you had to bless before the gods finally granted you a nap. Being Pharaoh in public meant constantly pretending you were having a spiritually profound time while slowly roasting like a ceremonial duck on display. On the surface, you were Pharaoh, Horus on earth, Lord of the two lands, divine ruler of all things Nile adjacent. But behind that glittering facade stood an even more powerful force: the priests. You see, the temples weren't just for praying. They were banks, farms, schools, libraries, tax offices, and in all likelihood, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of data centers. The priesthood controlled grain, land, gold, public opinion, and metaphysical guilt, which meant that while you wore the crown, they held the ledgers. Every temple was a kingdom within your kingdom, and its high priest was its CEO. These weren't harmless old men humming hymns. They were political tacticians in robes, fluent in astrology, bookkeeping, and subtle blackmail. They managed the gods, the festivals, the omens, and more importantly, your public image. If you sneezed on a feast day, they could interpret it as divine disapproval. If you wore the wrong color sash, that might mean Ra was sad, and suddenly the barley riots start. And yet, you had to work with them. Without the priests, your divinity could vanish overnight. All it took was one new prophecy carved into a temple wall and poof, the gods have chosen another. Worse, the temples were tax-exempt. They hoarded wealth with holy immunity. Meanwhile, your treasury struggled to stay full unless you started a war, sold grain, or shook down a merchant caravan. The priests, they had golden statues of jackals with better retirement plans than your military generals. But the worst part, they pretended to serve you, Pharaoh. "We live only to uphold your divine will," they'd say, while quietly diverting resources, managing spies, and advising your enemies to try prayer, and also treason. You were the figurehead, the sunlit symbol, the living god, and they were the committee that decided how godly you were allowed to be this week. Mess with the temples and the nation rebels. Obey the temples and you slowly become their mascot. It was a power struggle with incense and passive aggression, and the longer you reigned, the more you realized. The gods might live in the heavens, but their accountants definitely lived at Karnak. In most families, drama means someone forgot a birthday or made a snide comment at dinner. In yours, it meant conspiracy, palace coups, and the occasional accidental crocodile pit incident. Because as Pharaoh, your biggest threat wasn't some foreign army, it was your own bloodline. You were raised in a palace full of siblings, cousins, uncles, and half-uncles who all believed they should be sitting on your throne. Some were ambitious, some were delusional, all of them were dangerous. Succession. That was a nightmare. Egypt didn't have a firstborn gets everything rule. It was more like whoever survives the most assassination attempts and secures priestly approval wins. Half the court spent their time trying to guess which of your sons might become the next pharaoh, and the other half tried to make sure it wasn't the wrong one. Your own children were groomed like rache horses. Each had factions, tutors, spies, and mothers whispering bedtime stories about how the gods always choose the most handsome heir. Subtle. Meanwhile, your brothers and uncles weren't content with being royal background characters. Every one of them had at least one general on speed dial, and a disturbing familiarity with accidental staircase tumbles. And of course, there were the queens. Yes, plural. You had multiple wives, often all living under the same roof, forming alliances and rivalries with the precision of political chess masters. One wrong glance at the wrong royal woman, and suddenly, the kitchen staff is quietly replacing your wine taster. Palace life was like living in a really beautiful, overly perfumed cage where everyone was either your relative or your future usurper. And funerals. Oh, the drama. Every death became a suspicious death. Every illness, a potential poisoning. Every coughing fit, a topic of temple gossip. Even your own burial wasn't safe. Tombs were looted, names were erased, and your own loyal son might finish your pyramid and then immediately start carving over your legacy because he wanted a bigger one. Being Pharaoh meant that the people who knew you best were also the people who most wanted you. Removed, politely, permanently. It was a royal forest full of snakes. So after a life of rituals, paranoia, heat stroke, and family backstabbing, you finally die. You'd think you'd earned a break. But no, in Egypt, being dead didn't mean being done. It just meant you were about to become a full-time spiritual symbol and a part-time horror movie prop. The embalming process begins immediately. Your internal organs are removed, weighed, and politely stuffed into canopic jars, each one guarded by a funereal animal-headed deity, like a post-mortem Pokemon team. Your brain pulled out through your nose with a hook, not because it's useless, but because tradition says so. Then you're stuffed with resin-soaked linens and matron salts until you resemble a sacred raisin in a very fancy bandage. Your body becomes a political relic, wrapped tighter than your palace tax scrolls. Next comes the coffin, or rather coffins, plural. You're stuffed into a series of increasingly ornate wooden boxes like some kind of divine nesting doll, each covered in gold leaf inscriptions and protective spells in case you encounter rude ghosts on your way to the afterlife. But the real showstopper, the tomb. You've spent half your life and half the kingdom's GDP constructing a mausoleum designed to scream immortality. Walls covered in instructions, prayers, and awkwardly drawn images of you smiting enemies who definitely aren't going to bother you in the afterlife. Unfortunately, your tomb also screams, "Please rob me." Despite curses, guards, and architectural misdirection, most pharaohs' tombs were looted within decades, sometimes hours, of being sealed. So, while your priests were chanting prayers over your eternal spirit, local criminals were sprinting off with your gold-plated footrest. But the worst part, if your name is forgotten, if your tomb is defaced, or if your mummified body ends up in a museum gift shop 3,000 years later, you don't get to enjoy the afterlife at all. That's right. One bureaucratic oversight and you're stuck haunting some poor archaeologist forever. You might have been king in life, but in death, you're museum bait, political currency, or a cautionary tale carved into limestone. And just think, you haven't even reached the judgment hall yet. For someone marketed as a divine being, you sure spent a lot of time in mortal danger. Being pharaoh wasn't just about building temples and posing for statues. No, it also meant leading armies personally, as in grab your war chariot, strap on a bronze sword, and go smite some foreigners before breakfast. Your generals made the plans. The scribes wrote the propaganda. But you had to show up and pretend you weren't terrified, because divine authority only worked if people saw you physically leading the charge, even if you had absolutely no idea how to hold a spear without looking like you were trying to pick up laundry. And forget hiding in a tent like some medieval king. You were expected to ride at the front of the formation, waving a ceremonial axe and shouting your divine catchphrase, usually something like, "The gods will crush you," while silently hoping the enemy didn't have better archers this year. Even if the battle went well, you couldn't win quietly. You had to return home with prisoners, loot, and enough severed hands to impress the temple accountants, all of which would be paraded through the streets while you smiled and tried to look both humble and terrifying. Lose the battle, though? That's a problem. A big one, because pharaohs don't lose. If you got injured, humiliated, or, gods forbid, ran away, the priests might interpret it as divine displeasure, or worse, an excuse to replace you with someone who hasn't been cursed by defeat. So now you're stuck in a cycle. Raise taxes to fund a war, fight the war to protect your image, then build a monument to exaggerate the war in case people noticed you nearly died. It's expensive, exhausting, and extremely bad for your blood pressure. And here's the kicker. Even if you didn't want to fight, you often had no choice. Generals demanded it. Advisors insisted. The gods sent a dream. Or maybe the priests just ran out of things to do and decided it was smiting season again. You weren't just pharaoh. You were the marketing department for national military ambition. And if you didn't win, you'd better hope they bury you fast, because history isn't kind to divine war heroes who come home without trophies. After all the rituals, warfare, backstabbing siblings, and linen-wrapped paranoia, you'd think history would at least give you a standing ovation. But no, the final insult of being pharaoh was this. Your legacy was entirely out of your hands. You could commission the grandest temple, carve your name on every obelisk, and bury yourself beneath a mountain of gold. But all it took was one jealous successor with a chisel, and poof, you never existed. Name erased, statues defaced, achievements reassigned to your great-nephew, who ruled for 6 minutes and declared himself son of the sun and also super cool. Erasing names wasn't just pettiness, it was spiritual murder. In ancient Egypt, if no one spoke your name, your soul couldn't reach the afterlife, which means you weren't just forgotten. You were trapped in cosmic limbo, because your great-grandson wanted your pyramid budget. And even if they didn't erase you, they might just rewrite you. Suddenly, your disastrous battle becomes a glorious victory. Your mild-mannered personality upgraded to unquestionably heroic. That embarrassing crocodile incident omitted entirely. Future generations treated your legacy like a group project they didn't read the notes for. You were remembered not as who you were, but as what made the next guy look better. And for some pharaohs, the real humiliation came thousands of years later, when their carefully guarded tombs were discovered by archaeologists who immediately cracked them open, put their mummies under fluorescent lighting, and shipped their fingernails to museums. That gold sarcophagus you spent your life preparing, it's now a display case for elementary school field trips. Your royal toenail clippings are tagged, cataloged, and possibly available in the gift shop as keychains. You ruled empires. You were a god. And now you're a skeleton in a climate-controlled box, while tourists mispronounce your name and wonder if your curses are still active. So yes, you were the living embodiment of divine order, the chosen of Ra, the lord of the two lands, and your greatest reward being slightly misrepresented by a travel blogger 3,000 years later. Harold Sigerson entered the world in the year 1015, screaming, "We assume," into a kingdom already on fire. Norway was a battleground. His half-brother Olaf Haraldsson was fighting tooth and axe to unify the country under one crown. It wasn't going well. The nobles hated Olaf. The Danes wanted his head. And the old pagan traditions were cracking under the weight of Christian kingship. So, baby Harold was born not into a cradle of comfort, but into a world of sword points, shifting alliances, and blood feuds. His family wasn't ordinary either. His father, Sigurd Sayr, was a minor king, more farmer than warrior, but wealthy and respected. His mother, Austa Gudbrand Data, was the political fire starter of the family, ambitious, shrewd, and fiercely Christian. And most importantly, she was the mother of Olaf Haraldsson, soon to be saint. Olaf. That made Harold a prince, by blood and destiny, and a younger brother who would grow up watching a warrior king try to claw a country into unity. From the beginning, Harold wasn't treated like a child who might one day do something important. He was trained like a future chess piece in a game that was already bloody. By age 10, he could handle a sword. By 11, he knew how to ride. And by 15, he was riding into battle. Yes, 15. That was the year Olaf lost his throne to Danish invaders and returned from exile in 1030 to reclaim it. He gathered a ragged army of loyalists and marched to his doom at the Battle of Stikled. And guess who rode with him? Harold. Just 15 years old, Harold rode beside his legendary brother into the teeth of a superior army. No war paint, no glorious armor, just a teenager in chainmail with too much idealism and not enough fear. The battle was a disaster. Olaf was killed. Harold, wounded and probably in shock, was forced to flee into the mountains with the scraps of the army. And from that moment on, Harold would never be a child again. He would be a fugitive, a survivor, and a man shaped by defeat. The Viking prince had entered the stage, not in glory, but in blood and retreat. This was not the end of Harold's story. It was just the prologue. After Stiklestad, Harold didn't disappear. He retreated. Wounded and grieving, he fled eastward, crossing the snowy spine of Scandinavia into the wide rivers and dark forests of Kiev and Raus. To most Norwegians, that meant exile. But to Harold, it was a second chance. At the time, Kievan Rus was a rising powerhouse, Slavic, Norse, Byzantine influenced and ruled by Yaroslav the Wise. Lucky for Harold, Yaroslav had a soft spot for well-connected Viking royalty. Even luckier, Yaroslav's court was already crawling with Norse mercenaries. Harold fit right in, but this wasn't some cushy guest spot in a royal palace. Harold signed up to fight, and fight he did. Against raiders, steppe nomads, rebellious princes. Harold earned his scars and his silver. He impressed Yaroslav so much that he was given command of troops barely a year after arriving. He also may have fallen in love with one of Yaroslav's daughters, but we'll get back to that. The young Viking's reputation grew. He was tall, fierce, and clever with tactics. While most warriors charged headlong into battle, Harold flanked, feinted, and waited for his moment to strike. If you were under his command, you learned discipline. If you faced him, you learned regret. By now, Harold had matured into something far more dangerous than a desperate teenage prince. He was an operator, a warlord in exile, with no throne, no homeland, and no master. But Russ's wasn't where Harold planned to end his days. It was a forge shaping the iron. He wanted more. And so in the late 1030s, Harold turned his gaze southward to Constantinople. It was the richest city on earth, guarded by walls taller than most mountains back home and filled with gold, politics, and endless war. The Byzantine emperor needed soldiers. Harold needed a kingdom. A deal was waiting, so he left Yaroslav's court and traveled to the city the Norse called Miklagard, the Great City. He wasn't going as a pilgrim. He was going to join the most elite mercenary unit of the medieval world, the Varangian Guard. This wasn't just a career move. It was an invasion of the Byzantine Empire from the inside, and Harold was about to become one of the most feared swords in their arsenal. When Harold reached Constantinople in the early 1040s, he entered a world that made even the wealthiest Viking wise look like peasants. The great city gleamed with domes, mosaics, silk, and secrets. This was the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, and Harold wanted a piece of it. He joined the Varangian Guard, an elite unit made up mostly of Norse and Anglo-Saxon mercenaries. Their job: guard the emperor, fight his wars, and keep a very sharp axe handy in case things got political. Harold wasn't just another brute with a beard. He rose fast. His height, his cunning, and the sheer ferocity of his fighting style turned heads. He didn't just survive in Byzantium, he thrived. Over the next few years, Harold Hardrada became a living storm. He fought in Sicily against Arab rebels. He battled pirates in the Aegean. He marched through Anatolia, crossed into the Holy Land, and even reached as far as Jerusalem, where, legend says, he bathed in the River Jordan and made a vow to someday rule a kingdom of his own. But Harold wasn't just swinging a sword. He was watching, learning, plotting. Byzantine politics were a viper pit. Courtiers, generals, and eunuchs all stabbing each other in the back with a smile. And while Harold couldn't out-scheme the palace elite, he could outlast them. He was there during multiple emperor swaps, civil unrest, and shady palace coups. And through it all, he kept rising. He also got very, very rich. Spoils of war, bribes, gifts. Some say he even stashed treasure in Constantinople to collect later. He wore silk, not fur, gold, not bronze. This wasn't the Viking boy who fled Stiklestad. This was a seasoned warrior with more Byzantine polish than most Greek courtiers. But Harold was never going to be content guarding someone else's throne. And when the emperor began to see him as a threat, just another ambitious foreigner with too much gold and too many friends, Harold decided it was time to leave. He escaped Byzantium the way he'd survived everything else, with a combination of nerve, muscle, and sheer Viking stubbornness. He'd spent nearly a decade fighting for emperors. Now he would fight for himself. His next stop, home, Norway. And this time he wasn't coming back to beg. He was coming back to rule. By 1045, Harald Hardrada was done being anyone's hired sword. He returned to Scandinavia, a battle-hardened warlord, glittering with Byzantine gold, trailing exotic mercenaries and carrying enough battlefield experience to make most kings look like amateurs. But Norway wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet. At the time, Norway already had a king, Magnus the Good, the illegitimate son of Harald's half-brother, Saint Olaf. Magnus had been holding the throne reasonably well. He was young, popular, and had united both Norway and Denmark under his rule. But what he didn't have was Harald's experience, Harald's wealth, or Harald's ambition. So Harald did what any self-respecting Viking power player would do. He hired an army. Using his Byzantine treasure hoard, Harald recruited fighters from across Rus and Sweden. Then he struck a deal with Svein Estridsson, Magnus's rival in Denmark. Harald would help Svein reclaim Denmark, and in return, Svein would help Harald challenge Magnus for Norway. It was a messy medieval bromance based entirely on mutual hatred and longboats. But Harald didn't actually need to invade. Magnus, sensing a bloody civil war in the making, made a surprising move. He offered to share the throne with Harald. It was a power-sharing deal that was never meant to last. The two co-ruled Norway with all the tension of a forced marriage between a peaceable king and a returning war machine. It was like trying to split a crown between a monk and a lion, and Harald wasn't the monk. In 1047, just 2 years into their uneasy arrangement, Magnus died suddenly. Some say illness, others whisper poison. Harald didn't waste time mourning. He seized the throne of Norway without blinking and made it crystal clear. He was now sole king. But he wasn't satisfied. He wanted Denmark too. And so began nearly 2 decades of war between Harald and Svein Estridsson. Raids, battles, skirmishes. Harald hammered Danish coasts with the same energy he once brought to Arab fortresses. He burned towns, seized ships, and left no village unplundered. Yet he could never quite hold the land. Denmark resisted, Svein survived, and the throne remained out of reach. Still, Norway was his, and Harald ruled it like a man who had spent 20 years fighting for the right to wear a crown. But he hadn't forgotten about England, and soon his eyes turned west. By the late 1040s, Harald Hardrada sat on the throne of Norway, not just as a warlord turned king, but as the last true Viking monarch. He ruled with the discipline of Byzantium, the ferocity of Rus, and the ambition of a man who had never forgotten what it meant to lose. His rule was anything but gentle. Harald raised taxes, centralized power, and crushed dissent. Nobles who opposed him either bent the knee or vanished. He used his wealth to maintain a standing army and a fleet, an unheard-of luxury for Norwegian kings of the time. He built churches, minted coins, and made it clear Norway wasn't some northern backwater anymore. It was a real kingdom with real teeth. But Harald's idea of kingship was medieval realpolitik. He wanted loyalty, but only after obedience. He wanted peace, but on his terms. If a local chieftain challenged him, Harald sent troops. If peasants protested taxes, they met swords. He wasn't a tyrant. He was just Viking royalty with imperial instincts. And the Norwegians, frankly, didn't know what hit them. Still, his reign wasn't all steel and fire. Harald was also a man of culture. He wrote poetry, often about himself, naturally, and supported scolds who immortalized his deeds in verse. He maintained trade routes across Europe and even re-established contacts with the Byzantine court, just in case his treasure stash needed revisiting. He also never stopped warring with Denmark. Every summer, like clockwork, he'd launch a new raid, sailing down to Danish shores, torching villages, taunting Svein Estridsson, like an annual reminder that he still had a score to settle. These campaigns were less about conquest now and more about pride. Harold couldn't let go, and Svein refused to die, but even Harold knew he was getting older. By the early 1060 as, he started grooming his son, Olaf Kira, for the throne. He probably expected to rule a few more decades, retire into legend, maybe die in his sleep, surrounded by gold and loyal warriors. But then came 1066, the year England exploded into chaos. Edward the Confessor had died without an heir. Competing claims flooded in, and Harold, gray at the temples, but still sharp as a spear, saw his last great chance. He didn't just want Norway or Denmark anymore. He was coming for England. 1066 wasn't just a year. It was the year, the kind that turns a king into a legend or a corpse. And Harold Hardrada, nearing 50, but still built like a bear, was about to roll the dice one last time. Edward the Confessor, King of England, had died childless. The throne was up for grabs. Harold Godwinson claimed it. William of Normandy prepared to invade. But then, from the icy north came Harold, because why not? He had a half-baked claim through an old deal with the Danish king Knut, who once ruled England. Did it make sense legally? Not really. But in Viking logic, a claim plus an army equals a throne. And Harold brought an army. He allied with Tostig Godwinson, the bitter exiled brother of Harold, England's new king. Tostig promised English support. Harold promised steel. With around 300 long ships and over 10,000 warriors, he sailed across the North Sea, just like Viking ancestors had done for centuries. Only this time, it wasn't a raid. It was a full-scale invasion. In September 1066, he landed near the Humber and advanced toward York. The English weren't ready. At the Battle of Fulford, Harold crushed a hastily assembled force under the northern ears. The gates of northern England opened. York surrendered. The old Viking magic was back. Harold was confident. This wasn't Byzantium's twisted politics or Denmark's stalemates. This was raw conquest. He set up camp at Stamford Bridge, demanding hostages from the region. And then surprise, Harold Godwinson, the English king, had force-marched his army north from London in under a week. He arrived at Stamford Bridge on September 25th, catching Harold's forces completely off guard. Many of Harold's men had left their armor behind, expecting negotiations, not a battle. What followed was brutal. The Vikings fought fiercely, but they were outmaneuvered, outnumbered, unprepared. One berserker reportedly held the bridge alone, buying time. But even Viking courage had its limits. In the melee, Harold took an arrow to the throat. The Viking thunderhead fell in battle, swinging his sword until the very end. It was the last great Viking invasion of England, and with Harold's death, the Viking age itself died with him. September 25th, 1066. Harold Hardrada met his fate on a grassy field near Stamford Bridge, and with him died the last true Viking dream of conquest. It was supposed to be a negotiation day. Harold had left his chainmail behind, basking in the afterglow of victory at Fulford. His men were relaxing. The weather was mild. England looked ripe for the taking. Then came the dust cloud. Harold Godwinson had pulled off one of the fastest troop movements in medieval history. He and his army had marched nearly 200 miles in under 4 days, and they didn't arrive quietly. The English caught the Norwegians totally unprepared, scattered, and mostly unarmored. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Still, the Vikings didn't roll over. They fought with the desperation of men who knew the North Sea was too far behind them. A single warrior blocked the narrow bridge with a massive axe, delaying the English advance and turning himself into instant legend. He allegedly killed over 40 men before being stabbed from beneath the bridge by a spear. That's how desperate things were. Kings were relying on bridge trolls to buy them time. Harold, once he realized what was happening, scrambled to form a shield wall, but it was chaos. Men arriving in pairs without armor, rushing into formation as arrows rained down. Then the English cavalry slammed into their flanks. The shield wall held for a while. Harold himself fought like the berserker he was once trained to be. According to legend, he swung a massive two-handed sword with both hands, towering above his men like a war god. He killed, bled, and roared. Then came the arrow, straight through the windpipe. The last great Viking king fell without a final word. When reinforcements from the ships finally arrived under Einstein Aura, Harold's standard bearer, it was too late. They found the field littered with corpses. Einstein himself died in what became known as Orus Storm, a doomed counterattack that ended in more Norse blood-soaking English soil. Out of Harold's massive fleet of 300 ships, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. The message was clear. The age of Viking conquest was over. The dragon ships would sail home, but their fire was gone. Harold Hardrade's death at Stamford Bridge didn't just end a campaign. It closed a chapter in world history. The Viking Age, that glorious, brutal, gold-hungry century of raids, sagas, and long ships, had officially breathed its last, and fittingly, it died with a Viking king falling in battle far from home, sword in hand, lungs filling with blood. But the impact rippled far beyond the battlefield. In the days after the battle, Harold Godwinson barely had time to breathe. As the Norwegians limped back to their ships, Harold received word that another invasion had landed in the south. William of Normandy. Had Harold not attacked when he did, Harold Godwinson might have had more time to prepare. Instead, barely 3 weeks after crushing one invader, he had to face another. At Hastings on October 14th, Harold fell to the Normans, and England passed into new hands. So, in a strange twist of fate, Harold Hardrade, who failed to take the English crown, may have paved the way for William to do just that. The chaos Harold brought north weakened the kingdom just enough to crack open the door. Meanwhile, back in Norway, the news hit like a cold wave. The once invincible Harold, hero of Rus, scourge of Byzantium, ruler of a proud kingdom, was gone. His son, Olaf Kira, took the throne. But Olaf wasn't his father. He was a quieter ruler, more interested in peace than plunder. Under his reign, Norway stabilized. The old Viking fire cooled into politics, trade, and Christianity. The longships were still there, but they stopped being weapons and became tools of commerce. No more berserkers charging monasteries. No more gods demanding blood on the beaches. No more kings with their eyes fixed west, dreaming of silver and conquest. The sagas would still be sung, but the men who inspired them were now ghosts. Harold's life was the Viking world's last great epic. From snowy Norway to the golden domes of Constantinople, from steppe skirmishes to English meadows, he embodied everything the Viking Age stood for: bravery, ambition, ruthlessness, and above all, motion. But after Stamford Bridge, that motion stopped, and the Norse world turned its gaze inward. The Viking Age had ended. The medieval world had begun. Harold Hardrade's death may have marked the end of the Viking Age, but his legacy was too large to be buried with him. Even centuries later, his story echoes through sagas, ballads, and history books like a battle horn across a fjord. He wasn't just a king. He was a symbol of a dying age, of Viking ambition at its wildest, and of what happens when a man refuses to fade quietly into history. Historians argue over how to define Harold. Was he a conqueror, a poet, a cold-blooded killer? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle. He wrote verse, but also ordered raids that reduced villages to ash. He built churches in Norway, but also left fields soaked with blood from Sicily to Stamford Bridge. He was both brute and bard, builder and destroyer. But what no one questions is his greatness. No other Viking traveled as far, fought in as many wars, or accumulated as much wealth and renown as Harold. He served emperors, defied kings, and bent whole armies to his will. While most Norse leaders faded into legend with a few sagas and a cairn, Harold carved his name into 3 empires. His poetry survives. His name echoes in the Heimringler and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and his exploits still challenge modern filmmakers, writers, and scholars to figure out how one man could pack 3 lifetimes into 50 years. Even the name Hard Raider, meaning hard ruler, speaks volumes. It wasn't an insult. It was a warning. Harold didn't bend. He ruled as he fought, with fire in his blood and a blade in his hand. After his death, Norway changed. Olaf Kira, his son, ushered in peace and prosperity. Trade blossomed, the sword was sheathed, and the Viking era turned into memory. But Harold remained larger than life. In Norway, he became a national icon. In Iceland, a saga subject. In England, a cautionary tale. And in Byzantium, a ghost of the north who once stood guard over emperors. He was the last Viking king, and he died as he lived with a sword in his hand, chasing a crown. When the long ship stopped sailing and the mead halls quieted, the world turned. But Harold Hardrada had already made sure it would remember his name. To the Vikings, a ship wasn't just wood, nails, and sailcloth. It was identity, legacy, and destiny. It was how you traded, how you raided, how you traveled, and how you passed on. So when a chieftain or warrior died, burying them in a ship wasn't just ceremonial, it was essential. In Viking belief, the ship was a sacred vessel that bridged the world of the living and the dead. Just as a warrior sailed across the sea in life to conquer foreign lands, they would now sail across the metaphysical sea to reach the afterlife. This wasn't a quaint superstition, it was a cosmic law. Life was a voyage, and death was simply the next leg of the journey. That's why these ship burials were so elaborate. The ship itself had to be worthy. We're talking about long ships up to 70 feet long, carved with dragon-headed prows, and built to cut through waves and apparently through spiritual dimensions. The body would be laid in the center, typically on a bed or pile of furs. Around it, the mourners would begin to fill the ship, not with tears, but with gear. Weapons, of course. A sword, axe, shield, and spear. Because even the dead needed to be ready for battle in the afterlife, but also tools, clothing, jewelry, and occasionally more morbid cargo, slaves, horses, and even hawks sacrificed to serve the master in death as they had in life. To us, this sounds brutal. To the Vikings, it was honor. The ship was then buried under tons of earth, creating a mound, a permanent marker of power. These weren't just tombs, they were statements. Here lies someone important enough to deserve a ship to the next world. And it wasn't just men. Some of the most magnificent ship burials, like the famous Osberg burial, belonged to women. Viking queens, priestesses, and aristocrats were also sent into the soil with ships and riches, proving that spiritual passage wasn't just for the sword-swinging elite. So, when we say Vikings lived and died by the sea, we mean it literally. For them, The ship wasn't just how you conquered foreign lands, it was how you conquered death. If Viking ship burials sound like legend, the Osberg and Gstad discoveries turned legend into fact. These weren't dusty old grave pits. They were time capsules, fully intact ships pulled from beneath the Norwegian soil, packed with splendor, secrets, and the unmistakable smell of legacy. Let's start with the Urberg ship, unearthed in 1904. When farmers started digging near a burial mound in southeastern Norway, they didn't expect to hit a 70-ton long dragon ship. But there it was, immaculately preserved,